Hello and welcome here at this online program about Duchenne and the brain. My name is Gerrit Heikoop and I have the honor to host you on this journey where we will share and discover what we currently know about the potential effects of Duchenne muscular dystrophy on the brain. I'm glad I do not have to do that by myself today. I'm currently joined by Elisabeth Vroom. You are the chair of the World Duchenne Organization. Welcome, Elisabeth.
Thank you.
Let's start with the why. Why are we talking about Duchenne and the brain today?
Well, that it's today is because every year on World Duchenne Awareness Day, we have a specific theme. Has been nutrition, early diagnosis, and this year is Duchenne and the brain. And I think in general, the reason this is a theme and we're here today is that Duchenne and the brain is a subject which is more important than most people realize. And we are a little bit behind also in paying attention to that. So we try to catch up with the subject and spread more information about it. Yeah.
Exactly. So what can you expect from us today? We talked to some of the leading international scientists and doctors about Duchenne and the brain. We'll start with a short interview with Professor Ougénio Mérkori about why we need to consider the brain when we look at Duchenne patients. Then we talk to Natalie Downeweerd, who has a lot of experience of looking at the brain with MRI scans. Good, welcome, Natalie.
Thank you.
In between, we will hear personal stories from families about their experiences with potential learning and mental disorders in patients with Duchenne. And we talk with Jos Hindriksen, you're a neuropsychologist, and you will talk with us about the Big 10, what we might expect in the brain.
Yes.
And then finally, we will also connect live to the United States with Kaathi and learn from her what it takes to take all the scientific insights into the daily care and into the families. She has a lot of experience with that. And finally, together with Francesco Montoni, we'll look at the current state of research and what is needed when we move forward from here. Elisabeth, let's start with the basis. What is the relationship between Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is a muscular disease, and the brain?
Yeah, well, probably the naming is wrong, just to call it muscular dystrophy. I remember that François Lamy, you will see later today, that he once said maybe we should say Duchenne neuromuscular dystrophy, because the involvement of the brain is really serious. It's not just a small part of it, and for a lot of families, it's the major issue even. So that's why it's important, and I think in Duchenne in general, it's easy to think when children have a different behavior that might be because they have this physical problem. That's what you see every now and then. Like, of course, they have problems because they're in a wheelchair or they're weak, but it's really a specific problem or specific problems they need to get attention for.
Exactly. Now, and as the World Duchenne Organization, you provide a lot of information, a lot of education, and a lot of advocacy. Also in these beautiful animations, which we will scatter throughout this online program. And the first one we selected is a brief cut of what Duchenne dystrophy actually is and what the effects on the brain are.
Duchenne is not contagious. It is a condition you are born with and is caused by a change in a person's DNA, resulting in a deficiency or lack of dystrophin, which is an essential protein for the muscles. It leads to progressive deterioration of muscle tissue, which turns into fat and scar tissue. There also may be brain involvement due to lack of dystrophin. However, this is not progressive. While all have an increased chance of learning problems, only 30% suffer from intellectual impairment. Reading difficulties occur in 40%. Attention and emotional problems are also more common. There is no such thing as an average boy or man with Duchenne. Each boy or man is unique with his own strengths and weaknesses. They can live a normal, independent future and develop their own competencies, and with appropriate support can play a full part in society.
There is no such thing as an average person with Duchenne. We have a long journey ahead of us, and when you watch this is online, so you can pause anytime you want, you can revert anytime you want, and you can share as much as you want. Elizabeth, what do you hope that our viewers take away from this online program?
Well, it depends on what category they are. But I first of all hope that clinicians will see this and are aware that they not only have to focus on the muscle problems, but really have to ask specialists in the field to get to look at these children and make sure they get also the help, not only for their muscles, but also for their brain. I think that is key. The other is that families are supported in, and we will see interviews later with families. It's very often that the families are not supported in the idea that something is wrong with their child. So they say, well, he behaves as differently, and then they are not, they are sent away. So I think it's very important that families feel reinforced to make this point at the clinic and say, I see my child has other problems. I want him to be tested. I want him to get the support for this as well. That would be fantastic. And then last but not least, of course, school teachers, everybody around the boy, or sometimes it's a girl, should understand that they also struggle with this and not only struggle with their muscle.
Exactly. Now, and there comes the responsibility for you as a viewer. Obviously, this video is launched on September 7, 2020, World Duchenne Awareness Day, the day that we around the globe try to make as many people aware as we can of what is happening. So please share this video. Also, if it's after September 7, please share it and make sure that everybody sees it. And use hashtag WDAD, World Duchenne Awareness Day 2020. Show us pictures of how you are enjoying this online program, or share your most important insights that you have from this broadcast. Use the hashtag on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, any social network that you have at your disposal. So together we can all share the knowledge and work towards a better life for these patients with Duchenne. In this online program about Duchenne and the brain, we talk to leading scientists from across the globe about the impact that could occur in the brains of patients with Duchenne. The first one we talked to earlier this week is Professor Ougénio Mérkori. Elizabeth, why is he so important to this field?
Well, for sure, he's one of the leading clinicians, has seen a lot of children, is involved in drug development for the children and also maybe the adults, but he's really involved in all aspects of Duchenne care. And I think he's also active in the BIND project, where we will discuss later, I think. And so it's important to hear his voice, because I think he's very good also in really looking at the children and wanting the best for them. Yeah.
Exactly, and he is based in the Gemelli Hospital in Rome. So earlier this week, and here's a first shout out, Nicoletta Madia went over there with her camera crew and asked him a few questions that we now showed you. The first question she asked him, with so much clinical experience with these type of patients, what has he learned from a clinical perspective about the impact on brain involvement in Duchenne muscular dystrophy?
In the last few years, we have learned a lot about the possible involvement of brain and cognitive abilities in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. In the past, we felt that some cognitive difficulties may have been related to the motor difficulties experienced by these children, because especially in the first years of life, children learn how to perform activities by using hands or motor activities. Over the years, however, it has become increasingly very obvious that these cognitive difficulties were not associated with the motor ones, and we have been able to identify a spectrum of possible problems that ranges from specific cognitive abilities to hyperactivity or attention disorders, and attention problems are one of the major problems. These difficulties occur in a number of Duchenne boys. They are not invariably present, but when present, it's very, very important that we identify them as early as possible.
So the next question would then be, if we now know that part of this population is suffering from additional problems in the brain, what should we do with that knowledge?
The Duchenne boys who have cognitive difficulties that sometimes can be related to just specific cognitive aspects and not related to an overall global cognitive impairment, often have some difficulties in attention, and since they are very, very young, they can experience in delay in achieving milestones or achieving some other cognitive aspects. It's very important to intervene as early as possible, because if we can plan a very early intervention, these children will be able to achieve the milestones in a better way, at an earlier time, and this is extremely important also for school performance, for making these children eager to perform the activities that their peers perform. So as a pediatric neurologist, we tend to perform very early assessments of cognitive performance, of neurodevelopmental assessments, generally when we see the children with Duchenne boys soon after diagnosis. And this has proved to be very helpful in allowing these children to cope with the difficulties.
So we also like to learn from Oggénio Mérkóri how he thinks we could improve the support for these kind of problems and the families who have to deal with this.
Families should be informed that a possible cognitive impairment or a possible involvement of some aspects of cognitive difficulties may be present. And I think it's very important to provide information and also to perform assessment as early as possible, because this is really the first step to allow an improvement on all these aspects. So the support that can be given to families is to provide the best information available and to perform tests as early as possible.
Yes, that is really the key message that Oggénio is bringing across here. Early assessment, early assessment, early assessment. So the final logical question is then, does he think that everyone should always be assessed?
It's very important to remember, however, that when we talk about cognitive difficulties, not always we see a general cognitive delay. More often we found an impairment of specific aspects of cognitive or attention disorders, which are related to memory or attention, and this may be underestimated. If present, however, these aspects, even if minimal, can be responsible for low self-esteem and other difficulties in performing at school and interaction with their peers. So it's very, very important that a full assessment is performed, because even if minimal, even when present only with minimal problems, these difficulties can still affect performance and quality of life in everyday life.
Thank you very much, Professor Oggénio Mérkóri from Rome. Elizabeth, when you listen to him, what do you hope our audience takes away from this?
Well, first of all, what he said was the early, really early screening, which goes hand in hand with early diagnosis anyway. That's something we still struggle with around the globe, that children are diagnosed too late. But that is important. And I think also, and that we can't say that enough, don't leave anyone behind. So you have the boys with severe problems. These might be picked out by their doctors at a certain
stage. Seems to be sort of obvious.
Yes. But there are also the boys who seems to function normal, whatever is normal in life, right? But they still have that difficulty, might have that difficulty, specific difficulties. And education is for Duchenne boys even more important than for other children. That's also something people tend to forget.
Why do you say that?
Yeah, well, they can't become a truck driver. They can't become a carpenter. They can't become... So everything you have to do with your hands is difficult. So their brain is their holy grail. So whatever you get out of that is fantastic to help them to have a good life.
Yeah. So, and then the key message is we need to have attention for the brain, and we need to make sure we assess early on to see if everything is functioning well. Let's see how things are functioning.
Also the boys indeed who look like.
Exactly. So with that, I think we have clearly underlined the importance of looking at Duchenne and the brain today. Another thing we have in this online program is these beautiful interviews who have been produced with the families, the personal stories. Because yes, we will offer you a lot of science and a lot of knowledge, but in the end, it's also about how to deal with it in the everyday life. And the first one that we're going to look at, who are we going to see, Elizabeth?
We're looking at François Lamy from France, and his son with Duchenne is Luca. And he was diagnosed, he will tell the story very early, specific because somebody with experience recognized that something was wrong in his communication, let's say. So not the muscle weakness was the first sign. And I think that is very interesting also because many more children show at a young age already this kind of difficulties and are not picked up or a red flag like this could be Duchenne, this could be the diagnosis why he's different.
Exactly, and this ties nicely into some findings that the Dutch Duchenne Parent Project also found earlier this year, that by a research initiated by the project.
Yeah, it's just published last month with the TNO, it's called in the Netherlands. We were able to go back to the files of boys with Duchenne who were later diagnosed as Duchenne to see how they kind of perform in relation to children without Duchenne. And there you already see in boys as young as between 2 months and 48 months that they have their different scores when it comes to communication, but also first words, making sentences, eye contact, all that. So there is already at a young age something to see, and it would be fantastic, of course, if that at the end we would be possible to have a red flag if in standard testing, which is performed, for example, in the Netherlands and maybe in other countries, I think in Belgium as well, in all children, that you can pick out where they are already different at a young age.
Yeah, ultimately that we get an extra indicator on the list to determine whether we need further investigation or not, further tracing. Yeah. Well, let's start and let's listen to the story of François Lamy and his family.
A quick presentation of yourself and your family.
Yes, so my wife Jelena and we have 2 children, Luca and Irena, who are 13 and 11. And my son Luca was diagnosed with DMD when he was 15 months.
So, does your son have other difficulties besides the muscular difficulties?
Yes, he has cognitive difficulties that were discovered, let's say, very early when he was a baby by the woman who was taking care of him. Well, she discovered that he had a different behavior than the other kids, and she had a lot of experience with keeping small babies. And well, we didn't know really what to do with this because to us everything was normal. It was our first child, so we didn't had a comparison to go from. Then he was diagnosed with Duchenne, and slowly more problems were uncovered, and it became really clear that there was a cognitive problem when her small sister was able to do things that he was not able, even though he was 2 years older.
And what is the impact of these difficulties on the daily life?
Well, the impact is very important. Well, first of all, when he was very, very young, and we could speak with other people with Duchenne, and we thought at that moment, or we felt at that moment, that he suffered from another disease, because he didn't have really muscle difficulties at this time, but his emotional behavior, his cognitive possibilities were very different than other kids. And it started to be difficult, of course, when he was in the age to go to school, because we needed to organize his going to the school with helpers who needed to be all the time with him at school.
And do you have a specific plan to support your son for these difficulties?
Yeah, so we took contact with the people specialized in autism, and we hired helpers who are specialized in helping autistic people. And these helpers come to school and come at home to help him work and learn new things. So at the beginning, it was really more like behavior improvements that was searched, and now we try to have some cognitive improvement with learning and counting.
Do you think that education for this topic within the Duchenne community is really important?
There is a need for education. There is also a need for raising awareness about this, because it's even though it is known that with Duchenne we have sometimes cognitive difficulties, my feeling is that either cognitive or emotional difficulties are much more predominant in the Duchenne boys than we think. There is really a lot to do about it, and the cognition can be really improved, and the emotional behavior can be improved if we have early care, and education is very important. Awareness within the DMD community as well, and to put in place proper care for this specific need.
Next in our program about Duchenne and the brain, after this beautiful story from François Lamy, let's try to understand how this works. What do we know? What don't we know? And how can we better understand the effects of Duchenne muscular dystrophy on the brain? And for that, we are joined here in the studio by Dr. Natalie Dowrenweerd. You are a neuroscientist, researcher at the Leiden University Medical Center and the University of Newcastle. Elizabeth, when we were compiling this program, you immediately said, we need to talk to Natalie. What does she mean in the field of Duchenne?
Well, one of the reasons was to start with is how well she can explain this very difficult subject. And I remember being at a conference and a mother came out of her lecture and said, for the first time in my life, I understand how it works. So I think there was an ultimate compliment about how the brain, because we now know, okay, in Duchenne we see this, but what is happening in the brain? I mean, what is really happening? And I think you can explain it better than anybody else. The brain, the tissue is your MRI work, the story about the protein, the isoforms. Isoform is a variant of the protein which might have a specific function. So you're the one to tell this story. And it's also nice that you bridge two universities.
Yeah, very international. And in your bio it reads, not to be fooled by your age, because you're already one of the leading researchers in the world about this. Natalie, welcome. Glad you're with us. What we know, Duchenne is caused by mutations in the gene. All patients develop muscular problems, but not all patients develop learning or behavioral problems. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question and something that we don't have the full answer to, but we do think we have pieces of the puzzle. And one of those pieces of the puzzle is that in muscle, when you transfer the gene into a protein, there's one protein, full length, what we call it, that's really important. But in the brain, the gene is used in different ways, so that there's not just one product, not one dystrophin protein, there's multiple of them. And I know that's very difficult to wrap your mind around that, so I do have an animation to help explain how that works.
To visualize, yeah.
So if you picture that the gene is this highway and the car has to go from beginning to end, then actually there's an extra ramp halfway down the gene and then even further down the gene. So you've got a red car and a yellow car, and those are shorter proteins. Now, depending on where the mutation is, one or more of these proteins will affect it. So in this case, only the green car is stopped, but the red and the yellow car can still continue. If the mistake is a bit further down, then both the red and the yellow car run into trouble, but the yellow car can still continue. And if the mistake is all the way at the end of the gene, then actually all three cars aren't able to pass. So that is why, to some extent, depending on where the mutation is within the gene, patients are more prone, or we see higher incidence of the learning and behavioral problems than, for example, when the problem is all the way at the beginning. There's less. Tricky thing is, it's not black and white.
Oh.
So there are still patients who only miss the full length, so have a mistake all the way at the beginning, who still have learning and behavioral difficulties. And there are still people with the mutation all the way at the end who don't have difficulties. So it is just part of the story, but it helps us move forward.
It's a first step in understanding different places in the gene. Another thing is about timing, because this is also not the same for everyone.
Well, the timing when the learning and behavioral problems develop, I think Jos is a better place to address that, but we do know that these proteins they differ a lot. So when we looked at when they are present or doing their part in the brain during the lifespan, I have a picture for that. That actually it differs for each of these isoforms, and that tells us that they have a different role to play. That also tells us that our research has to triple, because we have to investigate each of these proteins independently to try and understand what their role is in the whole.
Okay, so that's the first step is you explain to us, we know a little bit how it works, but not exactly root causes and cause and effect yet. Now, one of the things you are famous for as a scientist is that you work a lot with MRI scans. One of the questions that came out of the community when we started to talk about Duchenne in the brain is someone who asked, is MRI also used or recommended for diagnosis of learning and behavioral problems in patients with Duchenne?
I understand where that question comes from. So at this point in time, I think the best tools that we have are from the neuropsychology, which is what Jos will be able to explain more. On an individual level, what we found with our studies is it's really difficult to pick out a boy with Duchenne from a boy without Duchenne. The power of MRI really lies in helping us try and understand, pick up on patterns, and really get to the foundation of where it all comes from. So not so much on an individual level yet, but really on group levels. And I think would be nice if I could show that as well. So
please, take us into your lab.
I have another animation for that. So here you see a picture from a boy with DMD on the left and a peer on the right. They're the same age, both 10. And just looking at the pictures, you might find that you see that actually the muscles on the side of the head, those are a bit bigger. But if you purely look at the brain itself and you take away all of the outsides, then really there's nothing abnormal or really that we would be worried about. So both sides, you've got the light gray for the white matter, the dark gray for the gray matter, you've got the fluids, everything as it should be. So it's not until we move to group analysis where we really use the computer for advanced calculations, and we really get to how many pixels and compare that between the groups, that we find that actually the total brain size is smaller in the DMD group compared to the peer group. So the white matter was equal in size, but we have another MRI tool where we can assess the white matter a bit more in depth. So actually, white matter is the long connecting fibers, and here you see a color coding for those long white matter highways, what we call them. And just to visualize that a bit more easily, because this is still a flat image, this is just the highways that connect the left and the right side of the brain. So there's really long connections going across. And we found that these highways were also on a microscopic level slightly different between the two groups. And the final thing that I want to show is that we also looked at the blood flow through the brain. We can do that with MRI. You don't have to do anything different. We found that on average, the blood flow was also lower in the patient group compared to the peer group.
Okay. So, and here's a reference to all the articles where you write about that. So you say you find at the first sight, you're not able to distinguish the difference, but then when you look deeper and more nitty-gritty, you find some differences. At this point, what do we know, or what do you think that these differences mean?
That's the challenge. That is what we're currently dedicating a lot of research on. We do have some hypotheses, so this is not proven, but the way we're thinking through all of this information, if we take the blood flow through the brain as a first example, that can be because of something that happens locally in the vessels that surround the brain, but it can also come from the rest of the body. You've got a heart that has to pump the blood around, you've got the muscles that help that, and we know that that is different in the people with DMD compared to the control. So we have to tease out where it comes from, because that would be something that potentially we might be able to do something about. When it comes to the gray and white matter, it's a bit more complex because in contrast to muscle, you can't just take a biopsy or a piece of brain. It really wouldn't be accepted. So you have to find other ways to study it. You can't put it under the microscope as is. So there's three main routes that we can definitely do. One of them is to investigate it in mice. Yeah. So there are mice who have different types of mutations, just like the patients have different types of mutations. And then you can look at their behavior, look at how well they perform, and then in the end also look at the brain under the microscope. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that you can do is what the images I showed was from a relatively small group of patients, so it was 30 patients. If you have much larger groups and all the variability in there, you will be able to differentiate more where each component plays a part. Because right now, I wouldn't be able to tell you if the brain is working its magic and compensating for the missing proteins, or if the brain is struggling. So we can't tell the good from the bad at this point in time. So we need a bigger group for that. Mm-hmm. And finally, what would be possible is the initial animation I showed, where we found out where and when dystrophin is expressed. That was human data, but it was because healthy people donated their brains for science, and they investigated all genes that they possibly could, and we focused on the DMD gene. But we don't know anything about brains from people with Duchenne. So if people with Duchenne were to want to donate, that would also open up the possibility to look at the brain after people pass away under the microscope and learn more from that.
So if I listen to you carefully, it basically sounds that you're on the beginning of a very long journey. You've done a very remarkable study with these 30 patients. You've found images and differences, but you're all the way at the start of determining why and how. If you look into the future, what do you hope this will mean in the future for patients and family? What do you hope to find out once you know what you see in the MRIs and what causes what?
I think hopefully it already helps to know that there's something tangible. So it's not something that's mythical. It's really there's something we can measure. There's something we can detect, that we can monitor over time. If we are able to figure out how it all works on a very, very small level, the way we learned how it all works for the muscle, then that would guide everything in terms of therapy development, possible treatment strategies where new compounds were generated. So it really is the key element in our future ability to help.
Yeah. And then it could help in the very early assessment that we start to learn that is so important. Perhaps, we don't know yet. Well, what kind of time frames are we looking at? Because probably families and parents are looking. No, but is this work? Are we talking a few years? Are we decades? What kind of time frames typically do these kind of researches take? And I'm not going to hold you to it, but just to manage the expectation. This is not something we know next year. Right?
It is something for the long haul. So
exactly.
These things take a lot of time. Like I said, when we already have the 3 proteins, that triples the research. Usually when you get a new answer, it generates more questions. So before we really can tell you exactly how it all works, it's more in the range of decades than it is in single years.
Well, it's important to set that straight. So it's a journey that has started, but we're not there tomorrow. Yeah, Elizabeth?
No. For example, we discussed in the past like donation of the human materials. That's also something that is not there overnight. And there's not a lot of that overnight. So that's something you can't predict how many people in the near future will give their brain for research. So I think that's also something that might... you might not be able to predict how long that part will.
What do you see as the biggest promise of this MRI-based research?
Well, that's a good question. I myself, but this is typically because that could be a shorter one, is the one about the perfusion of the brain. Mm-hmm. So that you think like, and I know you're doing more work on that at the moment. I think that's an interesting one. We could probably shorter term already do something. Yeah. So for that matter, maybe if you ask me what is your first interest, it might be that, because we can't change the protein, production of the protein. There's a lot of things we can't change.
But perfusion could be something you could more easily influence. Maybe. Yeah, exactly. But first we need to understand how that works. Yeah. Now, finally, Natalie, obviously a lot of these patients have a corticosteroid therapy. What do you know about the potential effects of corticosteroids on the brain? Is there anything known there?
Well, yes. I mean, corticosteroids are naturally part of the brain. They're supposed to be there. When you give them as medication, they are also able to reach the brain and work there, so they can have an effect. We don't know exactly what effect they have because there's not many comparisons we can make. You know, they're relatively young and they receive it over a long period of time. And I can tell you that from the study, the vast majority of the people who were taking part were receiving, as per the standards of care, the medication, but not all. And we weren't able to see any differences between those with and those without in the images. Jos, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that, you know, the learning and behavioral problems can occur with people who do receive this medication and people who don't. So even though there might be a role for it there, I don't think it's the main contributing, but we have to still determine that. Tricky is everybody gets it now. Yeah. Exactly. So we can't really compare it to a placebo or a neutral situation. We are taking advantage of the fact that there's cultural differences in the type that's prescribed. So in the Netherlands, we usually provide it with 10 days and then 10 days of rest and then 10 days on and 10 days of rest. And our neighbors in Belgium give it daily. So we are looking at differences with those regimes, but they might be very subtle. So we have to really investigate how that works. And
this research is also still kind of in its infancy stage. We're monitoring and see if you see any differences.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for sharing, Natalie. If people want to follow the work of Natalie Dورنويرد, I would refer you to the website of the World Duchenne Organization. Elizabeth, there's a library on the website. What can people find there?
Yes, the publications are there. But that's only the free access. But we also have a library for patient organizations to also look at the articles or papers which are not freely accessible. So still to help them to access this information. And also, you know, this will be repeated on the website, but also we have more information also about meetings and other things regarding Duchenne and the brain on our World Duchenne Awareness Day website. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, Natalie, Dورنويرد, thank you for now. Stay tuned, chip in later in the conversation. And thank you for sharing and explaining to us what is causing these potential learning and behavioral difficulties in the brain. And with that, Elisabeth, we go to one of these other very nicely produced family interviews. You briefly mentioned to me earlier, we are showing 2 today.
Yeah.
But there are many more. Where can people find these interviews at World Duchenne Awareness Day?
Yeah, they will be shared on the social media. And Nicoletta Amadia and her teams of the ARIM videos, they have interviewed many families like this. But this one is Márthá. She's a Duchenne mother from Brazil. And I think she has a very moving story. I think we first look at the story before I comment on it.
Let's have a look.
Começamos com uma apresentação de você e da sua família.
Boa tarde, sou a Márthá. Eu tenho o Henrique como meu filho, tem 15 anos, ele tem distrofia muscular de Duchenne.
Quais são os problemas que o seu filho tem, além dos problemas musculares?
Então, o Henrique também tem espectro autista. O problema é que isso foi detectado muito tarde, faz uns 3 anos só que a gente chegou nesse diagnóstico. E por conta da doença e por conta do desenvolvimento difícil, né, muscular, físico, ele começou a apresentar algumas questões que todo mundo achava que estava ligado à doença física. Como eu tinha outro filho mais velho, eu conseguia ver as diferenças do que era mimo, do que era birra, do que era querer chamar atenção e do que era alguma coisa que ele não conseguia entender. Então ele tinha um comportamento agressivo pela dificuldade que ele tinha em aprender, na própria escola, e então ele ficava agressivo. E aí essa agressividade dele era uma questão natural, mas era por conta de uma dificuldade que ele não conseguia explicar. Então, assim, tudo nele foi mais tarde, né? O Henrique ele foi adotado com 11 meses. Então, como ele veio de uma adoção, o físico dele, né, ele pesava uma criança de 3 meses. Então, ele foi sentar com 1 ano e meio, andar com 2. Aí os médicos, pediatra, especialista, eles diziam que era por falta do desenvolvimento da primeira infância dele, que ele ficou subdesnutrido, não teve afeto. Então, todo mundo associava isso a essa questão. E aí foi o diagnóstico da distrofia mesmo, eu fui ter com 7 anos. Depois de passar 1 ano fazendo tudo quanto era exame para descobrir o que ele tinha, né? Quais as dificuldades. E aí, por conta disso, também com 11 anos, quase 12, que eu fui diagnosticar o espectro autista.
Qual é o impacto deste tipo de problemas na vida, no dia a dia que vocês vivem?
Ele sofreu tanto na escola, né? Em várias escolas. Eu coloquei ele na escola até descobrir, né? A questão física. Ele foi para uma escola adaptada, uma escola, né, que atendia crianças com vários tipos de problemas físicos e mentais, mas como ele não tinha o diagnóstico da questão cognitiva, então ele sofreu muito, porque ele consegue romper muitas vezes essa dificuldade sozinho, mas se você oferecer ajuda, se você quiser ensinar alguma coisa, ele simplesmente se fecha.
Notaram estes signos muito cedo, não é?
Sim, comportamental, porque ele não conseguia falar, então ele ficava irritado, né? E ele não conseguia explicar o que ele queria, então ele ficava agressivo. Então essa agressividade era por conta de não conseguir, né? Esse impedimento intelectual de não conseguir se expressar, como se ele tivesse uma barreira, né? Que ele não conseguisse verbalizar aquilo que ele estava sentindo, querendo. Então essa dificuldade que eu digo cognitiva, porque ele tinha o raciocínio lá dentro, ele sabia o que ele queria, ele sabia, mas ele não conseguia transpor essa barreira. E aquilo gerava uma frustração, e aí ele ficava agressivo, ficava irritado, né? E gerou uma série de problemas que talvez, se eu soubesse, ou se algum profissional tivesse detectado isso lá atrás, teria sido bem diferente. A vida dele teria sido bem diferente.
Então, sobretudo em relação a esta experiência que você viveu, quanto é importante a informação e a educação sobre este tema?
Eu acho que é fundamental, porque todo mundo fala muito da questão física, né? Adaptações, inclusões, que eu acho fantástico e acho que ainda falta muito. O respeito, mas a intelectual, e eu acho que a gente tem que fazer um trabalho assim, realmente, porque ele poderia ter uma vida melhor. Crianças com qualquer questão física ou cognitiva, de deficiência, tem que ser prioridade também nas famílias, né? Se você quer acolher alguém, pense primeiro nela, né? Quem precisa mais, porque ele mudou a nossa vida.
Very moving story from Márthà Karotta Hennriquez from Brazil. That is her full name. Yeah. Elizabeth, what strikes you about this story?
Well, above all, as a mother, I feel how she suffers for the suffering of her child, how she can imagine how it must feel if you're in this body, which is not only physically kind of not helping you as a boy, but also that in your head things are not like they should be, how this kid has suffered for 11 years without the appropriate help. And I think people tend to speak about the burden of the mental problems or the behavior problems to the family. But what I love in her, and I feel with her, really every word she says, how painful it is to know that your child suffered while he could have been helped, you know. And I think that is something early diagnosis, early testing, early help. And you see the difference where Francois was lucky having a good, what was it, au pair or helper or nanny, whatever.
Yeah.
And so till now, it's depending on kind of luck who you encounter in life if your child is diagnosed and get help. And I think this is a beautiful story that illustrates why also the diagnostic overshadowing, that's a term we will hear about more later, is that it's typically, he was adopted, he was malnutrition. So my son was 10 weeks premature, so people think, he's premature. Yeah. So it's always...
Or if it's not that, it's probably the muscular disease.
There's always,
There's always something else.
Yeah, so you really have to be lucky now, and it shouldn't be luck. Everybody should have that possibility.
Yeah.
So
I think in the future, if we listen to Márthà, we hear her say a lot, could have, would have, right? There's all this remorse about what could have been better.
Yeah.
I think the aim of this program here today is that for the children of the future, we get them all the best of care.
Yeah, right.
And with that, we go talk with one of the other leading scientists here in this online program. We will talk to Dr. Jos Hendriksen, who is a neuropsychologist at Copenhagen and who is a partner in the Netherlands, Duchenne Center Netherlands. And this was definitely also someone on the top of your list, Elizabeth. If we talk about Duchenne in the brain, we talk about Jos.
Definitely.
For the international audience who is not familiar with Jos Hendriksen from the Netherlands.
To be honest, I don't think there are a lot of people who are not familiar with Jos. I don't think he needs a lot of introduction. For 25 years now, you're working in this field. Jos is exceptional, not only in his knowledge and dedication towards this subject, but also to the support for the families, not only in the Netherlands, because, for example, he put a wonderful book together which was translated, and now he has to help me in how many languages? I know Hebrew, I know Japanese, 6 languages, to help families and teachers and everybody around the child. And I think Jos is a lifesaver for a lot of families. That's for a large part in the Netherlands, but also every time he knows to bring also scientific discussions back to what it's really about. It's really about well, you tell yourself. I won't tell your story.
Exactly.
But everybody knows yours. Believe me. You will ask Kathie Kinnett later, and she will tell you as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you didn't know Jos Hendriksen, now you do. And with him, we're going to talk about the types of learning and behavioral issues we see in patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and maybe the need for standardization of care that we need in that. Jos, welcome.
Thank you.
Today, we talk about Duchenne and the brain for almost 2 hours. It's the theme of the World Duchenne Awareness Day 2020. Is this a new topic?
No, it's not new. It was described 150 years ago by Duchenne de Boulogne, and he already reported about brain-related problems. He described intellectual impairment, epilepsy, and language problems. But we are 150 years further, but the knowledge has only grew the last 20 or 10 years. And I've put a slide on to show that when you look at intelligence and Duchenne in the last 10 years, there is an increase in studies on this subject, but there's still a lot of it to do.
Yeah.
So it's not new.
The topic was immediately identified, but somehow all the research focused on the physical aspects.
Exactly.
And well, you for many years have been working on the psychological aspects.
Yes.
And you've prepared a great overview of the different problems that can occur in patients with Duchenne.
Yeah, it was my challenge to help to understand the complexity, because it is very complex, and we are looking from the clinical perspective now. So we look at the boy and we start to see what is now the diagnosis with which we are going to work, or which is the key problem for the boy. And for this purpose, we developed a theory which I call the Big Ten of Duchenne. It sounds good, something to remember, that's why I like it. And it's about 10 problems which you can divide into 4 domains. And I prepared some slides to show this to you, because you see here 4 domains with isolated problems, but I come to that later on. You see the red domain is about cognition, and Professor Mérkori talked about cognition, but what do we look at? The green domain is about learning. The orange domain is about emotions, and the black domain is about psychiatric problems. And I will guide you shortly through all of these 10 areas. It's undoable in 5 minutes, but to give you a clue, what is it about, so that you understand the Big Ten of Duchenne. Mm-hmm. So the first area is about automatization. And this is from a neuropsychological perspective, a very important function. It has to do with quickly performing a task on the automatic pilot. And from a brain perspective, Natalie would say it has to do with networks becoming more and more efficient. So when you have to learn the left and right distinction, or when you have to learn clock reading, that is all, everything of that is automatization. And a nice illustration of automatization is, I remember my first driver lesson when I was for the first time in a car, and when it wasn't automatized. I still remember how my brain was overwhelmed by all things, and things were not automatized. So that is what has to be learned by the brain in learning and in cognition. And we think and we believe that is a very important function.
And to put this into context, when you talk about the Big Ten of Duchenne, automation is the first one, and there could be a problem with automatization. That is what we're looking at, right?
But there is no importance.
Exactly.
All those
no
areas
ranking.
are as important, but you will see on my final slide. But automatization is an important one, and it can be a problem. It is not in all boys.
Exactly.
But professionals and parents should look at it and find out whether this is a problem, because then you can help. Clear. So the second area is working memory. And working memory, you can give very difficult definitions, but it is actually about a bottleneck. Information is coming into the brain, and it has to go through a bottleneck to go to the long-term memory. And when it's in long-term memory, you can quickly retrieve the information, and you have the information available for everything. And we know, parents tell me, when you ask the boy 3 things to do, subsequently, they only do one thing. And then you might think, he doesn't want to do it. But maybe he can't do it because he has a memory problem. And memory, working memory problems are known, and actually in Newcastle they have done studies in rats and in mice showing that there is an important factor of working memory.
And here we already see the importance of understanding that this could be a problem, because you would react very differently to your child if he is not willing to do the task or if he simply cannot remember the task.
So awareness is important, but if you realize what the consequences are of specific problems, you behave differently.
Exactly.
And you treat and you start to do different things with your boys. So the third area is about attention. And attention has to do with focusing. And people often forget that attention has also to do with defocusing. So not focusing on what is irrelevant. Maybe that is even more important than focusing, because when you look at all the things around, you can't focus. So pay attention to what is important and stop looking at irrelevant things has to do with attention. And again, the brain has to do that. The brain has to be open to filter that information. And it would be nice if MRIs could help us to understand that principle, so that we can maybe practically translate it into how can we teach them and how can we train them. And this is something where I always stress that we should not forget the physical effects. So if you have fatigue, that may result in bad concentration. So there may be a physical cause for concentration. That's why it is important that teachers should be aware of the fatigue, take care, because when you have fatigue, you can't concentrate. Mm-hmm. So that was the third area, the third of the big 10. The fourth is about learning to read.
Different color. We're now in the learning ability.
Yeah, we are now in the green area, in the green domain, where it has to do with quick and automatic, here it is, automatic decoding of signs into sounds. So when you try to read the text, which I copied from a book, you might come in the situation of someone with dyslexia, because you see all kind of signs which you don't recognize and which you can't translate and decode into sounds. And after you have decoded into sounds, you can decode it into meaning. So dyslexia is actually a fundamental problem of decoding things you see into sounds. And we know that in boys with Duchenne, dyslexia occurs fairly often. It is estimated that 30% of the boys, so 3 out of 10 boys, may have difficulty with learning to read because of the decoding of signs into sounds may be a problem. And the second area of the green domain is about dyscalculia, which has to do with mathematics. And I illustrated what I mean. It is not now about decoding signs into sounds, but signs into numbers. Different areas of the brain, for sure. We have done MRI research showing that different networks are becoming active, but it is a fundamentally different automatization process. And actually, until now, no research has been done on dyscalculia. We know from the clinic that it is a problem, but we need to do, for instance, research on this domain, which is important to be aware of. Mm-hmm. Then we go to the orange domain, and the orange domain is about emotions. Just to illustrate the basic emotions, hostility, sadness, and anxiety, and joy, of course. And 2 are in the big 10, and the first is anxiety. And especially with Corona in our mind, we always think of anxiety as something which is giving trouble. But in the first place, anxiety is a normal and healthy response to something which is a cause of a stress. It protects against danger. So in the first place, we should realize that in the basic, anxiety disorders are a reaction to something of danger. They may be inherited, they may be learned, and then we know that they can be unlearned. So it is important to see which kind of anxiety are we looking at and what is the consequence, because avoidance is often shown as a normal reaction to anxiety, but you should avoid the avoidance. That is the main lesson of treating anxiety. Avoid avoidance, because then the avoidance grows and you don't do anything anymore. And that brings me to the second emotional component of the Big Ten, and it is about depression, or helplessness, and that in basic has to do with sense of control. When you are out of a sense of control, then you may become depressed because you do a lot of action, but it doesn't have a result. There is nothing happening. So then you start to think and you program your brain that you can't do anything. And then
it sounds that this is very close to the core of what Duchenne muscular dystrophy is, right? Slowly you are losing the control.
So we know that learned helplessness is a very important thing to take care in boys with Duchenne growing up, having to cope with different losses of arm function and learning and so on. So we can help them to get into control by resetting their brain and by reprogramming your brain to look at the things you can influence and stop looking, defocusing of the things you can't influence. Okay, so there are 3 more areas in the Big Ten. It is about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which Professor Meirekiry talked about. The prevalence is 8 to 50% when you look in the literature. Until now, there have been only 7 or 8 studies, and they show a percentage from 8 to 50. So
that is a very wide gap, right?
So this clearly illustrates that we need to do more research worldwide using the same techniques, taking care of the specific problems of the Duchenne boys to get good grip on what is now attention deficit disorder, because it is more prevalent. We know that. And when you have made such a diagnosis, you can start treatment with behavior therapy or with medication, which helps. And until now, nobody has treated this with medication, while in normal population, in the normal boys, they give medications. And with Duchenne boys, they didn't. We didn't until now. So there is much to learn on this.
Sidestep, Jos, why do you think that is?
Because the focus was on the muscles.
Exactly. It's just simply not a focus area of the treatment specialists around these boys.
Yeah, Professor Montoni once said, we should start treating the brain. And that's I think that was a very good, I remember that very much. So the second of the Big Ten in the black area is obsessive compulsive disorder. So it is about repetitive, obtrusive behaviors and thoughts. And this may be a highly debilitating anxiety disorder. And the other one, and the 10th, is the autism spectrum disorder, which Professor Meirekiry talked about. So you see that the triad of problems that may be the core of the autism spectrum disorder. And again, this is more prevalent in boys with Duchenne.
All right, so thank you for introducing the Big Ten of Duchenne. If this went a little bit too fast for you, obviously this is an online video, so you can just skip back a few minutes and go through it again. Jos, how will this help the patients and the families? How will understanding the Big Ten help them further?
Yeah, that's actually the clue, and I made a drawing of it because this is what it is about. When you look to those 10 areas, they are not clearly isolated. No. And
so it's not just a checkbox, let's see what my patient has, check, and I'm done.
No. And but it also shows that there may be hidden problems. So invisible problems, which you have to look like, you have to search for them, and then you can find them. And this also shows that minor problems can have major consequences. And major problems can have minor consequences. So that's the clinical deal we have to deal with when we are diagnosing learning and behavior. We don't make a scan, we don't do we have to look and take care of all the problems. And when you remember the Big Ten, you may be fairly sure that you have had all the areas which are important and have taken in account when you are working with these boys.
Exactly. So it starts with raising the awareness that people should be looking for these type of potential deficiencies. That is what we're doing here today. Mm-hmm. You gave us some structure of what to look for, and then it's about creating the right therapy to deal with that on top of all the other physical therapy that is already going on. Very clear. Elizabeth, when you listen to the Big Ten of Duchenne, what questions does that raise with you?
Well, I think not that many questions, but maybe realizing again how complicated it is when you have all these overlapping issues. And I think that's for families difficult as well as in school and the clinic, like what is causing this a certain type of behavior. I think that is what you hear very often from families, and I'm sure that's what you hear as well.
Yeah. Well, when we were preparing for this program, we, as I mentioned earlier, some people already started to raise some questions and send some questions from all over the world. Is it okay if we throw a few questions at you, Jos? One of them is about whether there are any recommended techniques or methods to help specifically with speech delay or mental abilities in these children with Duchenne.
Yes, there are. There are several speech therapy interventions which can help. It's also very important that we not only think about speech, but what comes after speech, and that is learning to read, because learning to read has to do with speech. So you, for instance, you have to start early with reading education, because we know that may be more difficult automatized. So there are techniques to learn children to read as early as possible.
Exactly.
I think that is one we see as families quite often, and I'm sure that schools then recommend, you can do a class again, and then we start later. But that's
you should not do that, because we know that in average they have normal intelligence and they have learning problems because they have automatization problems. And if you do a class for the second time, the automatization problems stay, they remain, they don't disappear, they have lifelong consequences. So you should find out ways to compensate those problems.
Well, this is very closely related to a question that comes around a lot in the community, right? About recommended school types and education for boys with Duchenne. Would you recommend mainstream schooling or special education?
My answer is mainstream schooling, unless there are problems, serious problems, which make that not possible. But in primary, they should go to mainstream, and they should have education which fits with their needs.
And I can imagine some families around the globe watching this and saying, yeah, okay, I was a bit in doubt, but now I hear I should go for a mainstream school. But the school says, no, we don't see that happen. Can you give them some arguments of what they can tell to the school of why this is good for their son or child?
The first argument is that they don't have a learning disability or a learning problem. They have some cognitive problems related to the dystrophin, which make learning more difficult and, more important, different. And we have to find out different ways to teach them to, in the ways of brain, we have to find other ways, other networks in the brain to help them to learn, because the muscles in their brain, there's nothing wrong with that.
Wow, that's very strong. Please take this video into your school. It was Jos Hendriksen saying that. Yes. Elizabeth, any additional questions from your side?
Yes, I think you mentioned the Duchenne de Boulogne 150 years ago. He also mentioned then 2 patients with epilepsy. Mm-hmm. I know your group has done some further studies on that. Can you say something?
We also did some research, and we found that the prevalence of epilepsy is 5%, and in normal populations it's 0.5%. So it is much more often. And if you have epilepsy, we know that attention and memory may be even more a problem. So then you should first start to treat the epilepsy and then the cognition.
Okay, so it's a matter of stacking different therapies on top.
Yeah, stepwise. First decide. As in that point, we choose a diagnosis, we start working with it, and if that doesn't work, we go further on, and then you know what you are doing in your diagnostic process.
All right. Final questions that we saw in our social channels, perhaps interesting to both of you to react on that. It reads, does moderate mental retardation belong among issues connected with the lack of dystrophin in the brain? Do we know anything about that? And the answer could be we don't know, but the question lives in the community.
Whether a moderate intellectual disability is part of the Duchenne.
Yeah, and if it's caused by the dystrophins. Or the lack of dystrophin.
For one thing, and that I think I want to make that point, when we talk about intelligence, we have it about a lot of different functions. That's why I didn't put intelligence in my Big Ten. And it depends on the test you use. So we know that in the average, the intellectual capacities are low average of Duchenne boys, but there is some boys scoring very high and some boys scoring very low. So yes, moderate, lower IQ, I would not talk about retardation, is known from the literature, and that's now well known. And there is a relationship between intellectual, mental retardation and the area of the isoforms, I think.
Yeah, so if more of the proteins are missing, then we see it more often.
That is what we know now.
Yes.
But back to, it doesn't make sense to judge a boy by his group statistics. No. It's a one-by-one.
And we know boys with who have isoform of possible problems, but they don't have problems with intellectual function. So we need to do the assessment. And those assessments, that's one plea I want to make, should be made accessible all over the world. Because we live here in Netherlands, we have it accessible fairly well, I think, but there are countries where it's not accessible, and we should work on that also.
Very clear call to action. If you're joining us from anywhere in the world, let's see what you can do in your country to make sure that also these psychological assessments become available. With that, I think we wrap up this part. Thank you very much, Jos Hendriksen. And if you are curious to learn more about the Big 10 of Duchenne or more about the book, the updated book of Jos Hendriksen, please go to the website of the World Duchenne Organization, which is worldduchenne.org. Another thing we find on the World Duchenne website, Elizabeth, are these Duchenne care videos. And we're about to show one of these. But before we do, can you explain a little bit about the background of this project?
Yeah, so in the Lancet, there was a publication or series of publications, and Kathie Kinnett is very much involved in that, about the standards of care for Duchenne. This was done from the US, so it was published, and in Europe now certain countries are implementing it as well, and some are still working on it. But from that, Kathie and other people worked on having a family guide, so explaining to the families what was the conclusion and the consensus of these standards of care. However, that is still quite a lot of text to read. And as we heard today, not all boys reading is their hobbies, and even children with no problems nowadays, traditional reading is not the way to get your information, right? And also we know for some families it might be more difficult to read a lot. So what we did is that we really in lay language and short chapters explain parts of the standards of care. So these two are about learning and the other is about behavior. But we also have about emergencies, about cardiac problems, whatever.
Yeah.
So
basically about every aspect of care that you can encounter when you are working or living or dealing with a patient with Duchenne.
Yeah, and I would say Kathie is the red line when it goes from standards of care from a scientific point of view to get it to the families. So I'm very happy Kathie is joining us
she's with
today.
us, but we will talk to her in a minute. First, I want to show one of these videos. Let's look at Duchenne care video number 2 about behavior and adjustment.
Growing up is a process of dealing with stresses and challenges. Boys have to cope with normal stress situations, for instance, a first bad grade at school, but also with illness-related stress situations, like learning to drive your first wheelchair, or having a medical procedure that may cause pain. One important stress situation you have to deal with is waiting. Wait for others to help you, wait to have things your way. The good news is that we know from research that most boys grow into a better adjustment as they grow older. In other words, you learn to adjust to these difficult situations as you grow older. One important protective factor is help from friends and others, so you should be stimulated to spend time socializing. In some cases, boys and young men with Duchenne may develop behavioral or psychiatric disorders. It is believed that these behavior disorders are related to dystrophin in the brain. 3 behavior problems are important to remember. First, attention problems may bother you, as in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, which has to do with difficulty staying focused and paying attention, or stopping your behavior once you started it. Secondly, unwanted and recurrent thoughts may bother you and result in repetitive behavior such as hand washing or counting, which is called obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. Finally, social interaction may be impaired due to autism. This may lead to difficulty with change, focus on details, and an inability to empathize with others. These behavior problems make raising boys with Duchenne more difficult. If you have any doubts or questions, you should ask your specialist for advice. A psychologist or psychiatrist may help in making a diagnosis and a treatment plan. Early detection is key.
We are talking about Duchenne and the brain for the occasion of the World Duchenne Awareness Day 2020. And when we say world, we need to add some international perspective. We are currently joined live from the United States by Kathie Kinnett. Your name was already mentioned when we talked about the Duchenne care videos. Welcome, Kathie.
Thank you.
You are a clinical care advisor for the Parent Project of Muscular Dystrophy in the US, and you're also the director of the Certified Duchenne Care Center program. It's an honor to have you with us. Before I send you my first question, I'm quickly going to look over to Jos. Jos, you've been working together with Kathie for over 15 years.
I think it's over 15 years now.
Yeah. Can you tell our audience, what does Kathie Kinnett mean in the field of Duchenne internationally?
She is an inspiring advocate of Duchenne from the United States. I know her for a long time. We discussed a lot about behavior and about learning, and you organized conferences and were very important in the standards of care. So I'm very glad you're in today.
Yes, we are very happy to have you with us, Kathie. Well, let's start with that perspective from the United States. We talk about brain involvement in Duchenne. What is your experience? What do you see in families with patients with Duchenne?
So I am a nurse practitioner and have both clinical and advocacy experience. And I can tell you that from a social media perspective, as well as personal perspective, that the neuropsychological issues that families face with children are incredibly difficult. They're difficult to assess, they're difficult to manage, and there's also a stigma that's attached to behavior disorders. If a child is having issues with attention, there are evaluations that you can do for attention and ways that you can manage attention. But a child that's having issues with anger and a child that's having issues with impulsive behavior, those things are seen in the public as more to do with parenting and less to do with an underlying diagnosis, at least from a social perspective, are very difficult for families to cope with.
Exactly. And what type of activities are being undertaken to support families in the US? What are you aware of?
Oh, we have many, and many that we've engaged with Jos and Natalie to further our efforts as well. We have information on the website that is reflective of the standards of care that Elizabeth spoke to. There are approximately 16 different areas of care, and one of those is psychosocial. There are tools on the website that can help families and providers manage and assess those different issues associated with psychological and emotional and behavior and cognitive issues. So those can be found on the PPMD website, as well as in the family guide that Elizabeth spoke to that's on the World Duchenne Organization website. Jos convened an initial meeting through the European Neuromuscular Congress looking at the brain in Duchenne, and we have organized, or are trying to organize, once the world opens up again, another meeting, an additional meeting to further investigate what we know about the brain in Duchenne, what we don't know, how we need to find out what we don't know, and to work together on a global level so that we can investigate all of those areas, both from the US and from the European perspective, as well as the rest of the world.
Exactly. So there's dissemination of a lot of information and tooling to all the different groups, and a lot of research need to be done. What are some of the hurdles that you observe when we try to push this forward?
One of the hurdles is a lack of providers, at least from the U.S. perspective. There's a huge shortage of both neuropsychological as well as psychiatric providers and counseling. In countries with insurance like the U.S., it's difficult to get those things covered, or paid for. So it's easy for us to say you need to have a neuropsychological evaluation, but if your insurance won't cover it and you can't find someone who can provide that test, then that becomes incredibly difficult. It's also difficult for parents to convince their medical providers that this is an issue that needs to be investigated. It's easy for medical providers to say you're having difficulty walking, but it's more difficult for a medical provider to see the effects of behavior on a home and a family and the need to evaluate those issues. Jos, I'm sure you have other things that are barriers in Europe as well, correct?
Yeah, but the accessibility is, I think, a very important one. And I think it should be a challenge to find ways to make it accessible to everyone, especially in this time when we have internet and we can do things by websites and webinars and web-based diagnosis. So I think there's much we can win in the next years on this.
So what are you proposing, Jos, that we start to have online diagnostic tools and make them widely available?
But yeah, you could make, we discussed about making a platform of psychological aspects of Duchenne in different languages to have assessment instruments available for professionals and to have it more easily accessible via internet.
Exactly.
I think
one of the things that has been a barrier as well is we have many different tools at our fingertips, but they all evaluate different areas of psychological and emotional issues. For example, there are tools to evaluate anxiety, tools to evaluate depression, tools to evaluate mental health, tools to evaluate adjustment, but there's not one tool that will evaluate the neuropsychological and emotional and mental issues that go along with this diagnosis altogether. No. So parents are expected to have these kids who already have behavioral issues sit through a battery of tests that last for hours and hours and hours, and then try to evaluate from that battery of tests what the underlying issues are, and then try to manage them. So we're trying to develop a tool that will incorporate all of these areas globally. It's a global effort to develop this tool so that it can be used around the world to evaluate all areas with one tool.
All right. So that makes sense? Yeah, that makes sense and sounds like a very important first step. From your perspective, Kathie, what else needs to be done?
One of the other things that needs to be done is Jos spoke about learned helplessness, and we found that many of the behavior issues and anxiety and depression can stem from a loss of independence. Several years ago at one of the PPMD annual conferences, we convened a panel of parents, experts, medical providers to look at ways to encourage independence. And there is a publication called Education Matters that was originally one volume for teachers, one volume for parents. We've reworked that tool to incorporate both educational and parenting advice so that it can be used both at the home and the school for consistency, starting with diagnosis in early elementary, extending to early elementary and late elementary and early high school, and then late high school and beyond. And one of the tables included in Education Matters is a way to begin to develop your child's independence both at school and at home, and in hopes to stem some of this learned helplessness that Jos talked about, as well as to give children and parents and teachers some control over behavior and psychological issues.
Yeah, very clear vision, and I can imagine that feels kind of counterintuitive, right, from a parent perspective, because you're so much about relieving and caring, and now the indication is make them a little bit more independent. Must be difficult sometimes, I bet. All right. Thank you, Kathie Kinnett, for sharing your perspective from the United States and your very clear plea about more cooperation and see how we can convene as quick as possible to further integrate the research and the tooling together. Thank you for now.
Absolutely.
Let's end this segment with looking at another one of these very nice clinical videos that Kathi was very much involved in creating. This one is care video number 10 about learning and intelligence.
In general, the cells in a Duchenne patient's brain are in good health and remain so. But in some cases, intelligence may be lower than average. However, and most importantly, learning to read and learning arithmetics, for example, multiplication tables, may be an important issue during your school career. It is suggested that specific cognitive functions, like automation, concentration, and working memory, may be more difficult for Duchenne boys and men. This is probably caused by the lack of dystrophin in the brain. So the brain may be involved, but this is definitely not progressive. It is important to watch out for signs of possible learning disabilities and to act quickly when you discover them. Reading is very important for your future, as our society is reading-based, like reading books, emails, phone messages, etc. So it's essential that your parents and teachers are aware of this higher risk of learning problems. If they have questions about your intelligence, or when speech development or learning to read is progressing too slowly, there may be a reason for further psychological testing. Ask your medical specialist to start this procedure. A speech therapist may evaluate language capacities, and a psychologist may test intelligence, working memory, and concentration. Testing is fun and seldom causes unnecessary stress. The results of these tests may help to make an individual therapy plan and an individual learning plan. Early detection is key. Technical aids like computer programs or smartphone apps may also help to compensate. Boys with Duchenne should preferably go to a regular school, and the majority of them do so. Regular school has a lot of advantages for both the boys themselves and their peers, but sometimes individual or special education is needed.
We are talking about Duchenne and the brain, and we've talked to some of the leading scientists across the globe. But one of them, his name has already been mentioned during the program here today several times, I think. We haven't heard from himself. We're going to, in a few minutes, listen to Professor Francesco Muntoni, who is a pediatric neurologist from the Gosh Hospital in London currently. Elizabeth, like I love to do with our guests here at the table, why don't you tell the audience who comes across this video for the first time who Francesco Muntoni is in the field of muscular dystrophy?
Yeah, well, also he's a really world-known and leading clinician who does research as well. Since I think 28 years, he's in the UK working with children with neuromuscular disorders. So that's a long track record, but also because he's really now in the lead of the BIND project, which is the brain involvement in dystrophinopathies. That means that, and I think it's important to say here, we speak about Duchenne, but a lot of what we say today is also for Becker. Patients with Becker also have a problem with the same protein. So I think that's good to say. But this is a huge European consortium, also funded by the EU, which is really working on a lot of things Jos and Natalie have mentioned. And I think it's really good to know if you hear today us saying here around the table and people who are on the screens that we need more research. This could really be a big step, this project, because at once till now, projects like Natalie's and Jos were often funded by patient money. So it's really money till now, often, and some other sources as well. But that's not the same as having the opportunity to work together with such a large consortium around dystrophin in the brain, in fact. So, and he's the leader in that project, so he can tell us a lot.
Exactly. So for the first time, we have not for the first time, but we have a large research consortium coming up, European money funded.
Already.
And we connected with him earlier this week. And the first thing I asked him, like many of our guests, is why is it important to raise awareness for the aspects of the brain in Duchenne and Becker dystrophy?
Well, the first thing to say is that while in the past our attention has been focused on ensuring that people with Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy had the best possible outcome regarding their muscle involvement, and the cardiac involvement, it's clear that in a proportion of individuals, when the comorbidities affecting the brain are present, these individuals will also have difficulties in schooling, in fully integrating with society. And therefore, it's quite important to take an holistic view and not only look after the muscle of somebody, but the entire individual, and try to identify areas where improvement and help could be provided. Indeed, the fact that in a proportion of individuals with Duchenne and Becker there can be associated involvement of the brain is well recognized in the standard of care document, where, if you like, recommendation of the assessment and management are made. But having said that, I think it is fair to say that these recommendations are still not systematically used and adopted, and therefore this is an area where improvement should occur. That I suppose is one of the reasons why we are talking about it.
So they exist in parts of the patient populations, but obviously we are also very curious to learn from him what he sees as the most important challenges in treating these aspects of the disease.
Well, the first is really to be aware of it and having the right mindset. It's not unusual that even nowadays a young boy with Duchenne muscular dystrophy who may have some speech delay and other aspects of behavioral difficulties is considered to have two separate problems, and for pediatrician, for general practitioner, for school teacher, to tell parents that it's not clear why there are two problems in this child without realizing that actually it is the same problem as Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So this is an important aspect that needs to be, if you like, diffused and explained better to those treating Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy. The second important aspect is that there are well-known therapies that I use in the field of behavioral difficulties, for example, attention deficit disorder. And unfortunately, because of this lack of awareness, is almost an exception that an individual with Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy, in whom these difficulties are present, to access these therapies. So, if you like, is a lack of awareness lead to lack of realizing that this is an integral part of the condition that can be improved by specific therapies. These therapies are the general ones that are used in the field of, for example, behavioral difficulties. They're not specific for Duchenne, but there is no reason to think that they will not work and help individuals with Duchenne. And indeed, there appears to be evidence that from specialists who use the therapies for these allied disorders, that improvement in the behavior of children with Duchenne and Becker can be observed.
Very clear, and I love it how this really ties up our online program here today. I see Jos and Natalie nodding very intensely and also Kathi on the other side of the world. So obviously we are getting aligned, we are moving and looking at the same horizon. Then the next question I asked him is, what type of research is needed and what type of research projects are already going on?
Well, the first important point to make is that not everybody with Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy will have these difficulties. And this is an important realization. Firstly, there is no need to be worried if there is no brain involvement in an individual, because this will never present later on. Secondly, even if there was some level of difficulties, these are non-progressive. So these are important aspects. However, we have limited understanding of why some individuals will develop problems, for example, some learning difficulties or some behavioral problems, and others do not. And therefore, more research on what dystrophin does in brain is necessary. There is work that has been done in many countries, both on children and on animal models of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And recently, the European Commission recognized a knowledge gap and an importance of, if you like, addressing this aspect, and funded a consortium project for 4 years called the BIND project, Brain Involvement in Dystrophinopathies, that will assess from a number of different angles what is the dystrophin does in brain. There will be work on animal models, work on people with Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy, to try to better characterize what is that make different people a little different in terms of these difficulties, but also have a better understanding of what would be the optimal way to monitor these patients.
Yeah, there it is, Elizabeth. And I think it's important that our viewers understand that this is why we do these kind of World Duchenne Awareness Days, right? We need to raise awareness of everybody, policymakers, medical specialists, clinicians, that...
Reimbursement.
Exactly, exactly, yeah. So a lot of research needed, as we learned today, and a lot of research going on. And obviously, we are not starting from zero. This is not a greenfield study. There's already a lot of research going on. So the next question I asked him is, do you expect that any of the drugs, for example, some of the studies that are currently under development, will also have beneficial aspects for the brain?
You are aware that there are a number of drugs being developed for restoring dystrophin in muscle. The most commonly used one so far are antisense oligonucleotides. However, antisense oligonucleotides do not cross the barrier between the blood and the brain, and therefore they will not go into the brain. So at the moment, there is no perspective that the same antisense oligonucleotides that we use to treat the muscle of children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy could be used unless they were administered directly in the brain. But of course, before one was going to do that, we need to have more certainty on whether there could be improvement of some of the difficulties. We do know that in animal models, in the MDX mouse, the administration in the brain of some antisense oligonucleotides can improve some aspects of their behavior. But the jump between this observation and what would happen in the human is pretty big, and therefore, at the moment, more work is required in order to tell whether this is a sensible thing to do and whether it's realistic to expect there may be improvement also in the Duchenne boys. Regarding gene therapy, again, there are practical limitations and conceptual limitations. In terms of the practical limitation, the gene therapy is not produced, is not switched on in tissue that is not muscle because of how the viral vectors are engineered, and is done on purpose so that dystrophin can produce a high level in muscle and the heart. So it's not plausible to expect any improvement following AAV gene therapy. In addition, these microdystrophin that I use for the gene therapy are highly shortened version, and while they've been optimized to facilitate the function of dystrophin in muscle, it's not clear whether this also will make them functional in brain. So this can be tested, but at the moment we simply do not know.
And once again, this seems to underline, Elizabeth, that we're really at the start of a long journey. If we count the times that we hear in this online program today, we need more research, more work, it really seems that we're at the beginning.
We have to catch up.
We have to catch up. It's an important topic, and that's what we're raising here today. And thank you for being part of that. So since I told Professor Montoni that you would be in his global audience today, as a closing question, I asked him if he had any last advice for people around the people with either Duchenne or Becker muscular dystrophy.
Well, the important aspect is, again, awareness. Awareness meaning ensuring that this has been taken into consideration. And the reason for this is that there is experience that early intervention to address these difficulties leads to better outcome. So there is, if you like, it's important, therefore, to look for these comorbidities early and implement treatment. How to intervene is by, in case there were problem, by involving the neuropsychologist, depending on the problem, neuropsychiatrist, and people who have expertise in managing these comorbidities also in other conditions. They don't necessarily need to be super expert in Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy. As we do in other aspects of the pathology in Duchenne and Becker, what we need is to bring these professionals into our multidisciplinary team. They need to be part of our team, and therefore we will educate them on specific aspect of Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy, and they will educate us on what can be done regarding specific therapies and interventions. And I think this in the longer term will really lead to better outcome for patients with Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy in whom these difficulties are present.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Francesco Montoni. Elizabeth, when you listen to this, it's inspiring. We're all here, we're nodding, we're looking at an icon in the field. What is the most important takeaway that you take from his words?
Well, I think, and I always love the short-term first steps, is that at least the children should get the standards of care, which is already available for children with autism, ADHD. The guideline, I think Jos can tell more also about medication, about what is the difference between what the children with Duchenne at this moment get in terms of care, the average, not the lucky ones, but the average, compared to what children should get if you look at the standards of care for autism and others. So maybe you can...
Yeah, there are standards of care also for the comorbidities, which should be implemented in the Duchenne field all over the world.
And that's something we can do quite short term because they are there, right?
They are there.
Yeah.
They are there. Do we understand why it's not happening? If I'm a parent and I'm watching this, like, okay, so there are therapies and my child is diagnosed with Duchenne, but apparently these fields are not talking to each other. How do we bridge the gap?
That's because the brain was not in the picture so much as it is since a few years. And that's why we know, for instance, we know that we can treat attention deficit disorders with medication. But it has not been done until a few years ago in a group of children with Duchenne. And it also works with them. And it gives a relief and a much better quality of life, a better learning problems. And that's we should start.
And that's the news of today. And that's the World Duchenne Awareness Day theme, Duchenne in the Brain, this message.
There are things which we should start, and the awareness and the fact that we now are basically busy with the brain makes this accessible, I think.
And I think it should not be limited to the lucky ones, you know, who were diagnosed early or who went to a good neuropsychologist, whatever. We should make sure that as many children as possible would have access to this. And I think by saying this, we also have to keep in mind, we had a call with our friends from Argentina last week, and they said 50% of the families here are living under the poverty level. So we also really have to keep thinking about how we can bring these standards of care, which are existing, to these families, how we can help them, how we can support, because there's no use in only organizing things for the Western world.
So when you say we have to think about, do you already have an idea, Elizabeth? How can you, what can people start to do in their countries or in their communities?
I think raising awareness is something everybody can do almost for free, in this time of social media and so on. It doesn't have to cost a lot to do that. The second is that we can help, as was already said, to see what tools are there to have an idea what is the specific problem of a certain individual, because it's all, as we said in the very beginning, there's no such thing as a standard Duchenne boy. They're all different. So that's important in this. And I think we have just also, as a patient organization, as a World Patient Organization, responsibility to see how we, whatever we do, can get to as many patients as possible. And yeah, again, I think the message of today is early screening, but also early diagnosis. That's a major problem in Duchenne. Well, even in a country like the Netherlands, children are diagnosed late. And if I've been speaking to an academic hospital where they said, "Oh, we have a nurse who can look after dyslexia," and you say, "No, that's not." You really need to understand. Clinicians need to understand they're special people for this type of problems. That's not something you ask to a nurse to do. It's really the specialists we need.
Very, very clear message. Early detection, better treatment for all, and more research needs to be done. And we hope with this online program, we took you along on this journey, gave you some better insight on the importance of looking at the brain side of Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy. And we are trying to move you into action. Let me repeat one more time the hashtag for at least the World Duchenne Awareness Day 2020. That's the hashtag WDAD 2020. And we love for you to share this online program. Share the beautiful family interviews that Nicoletta Madia has made and produced on her channels, which we saw too. Share anything you see that triggers people to sign up for additional research, whether it's the BIND project, whether it's the disease donation that you so much need for your further research, anything you can do. And also have some fun with it. So if you have been enjoying this online program, please share a picture of how and where you have been watching this. Again, this will be online for the rest of eternity, perhaps. So you can always go back, go into specific segments, rewind, replay, and make sure you get the most of all the knowledge and all the insights that have been shared here today. And with that, we come to the final video that we want to play for you, the one that hopefully goes viral on September 7th to 2020 and maybe beyond. It's the thematic video of this year's World Duchenne Awareness Day, which is powerfully teamed around the world together. It's available in many languages, in Dutch, in English, in Spanish, in Greek, in Russian, in all these languages, available also on the YouTube channel of the World Duchenne Organization. So with that, thank you to all the scientists and participants in this online program here today. Thank you for coming to the studio. Kaathi, thank you for connecting from the United States. And also thank you for all the people who have been part of the recordings. Let's stay in this together and let's raise awareness for Duchenne.